Thanks everyone for coming out tonight. I think this is an extremely important night in that we are here to support Coffee Strong, one of only 2 now GI resistance cafes in the country. Hopefully there's more in the works, but right now Coffee Strong needs our support, and that is really what I want to draw your attention to tonight. In the context of talking about broader GI resistance that's starting to happen now, especially with this massive escalation in Afghanistan and calls as we speak to insert up to now 45,000 more American soldiers into that failed occupation. I want to begin by talking about kind of the process I went through that led me to actually write this book. Because my first 4 trips over to Iraq, I went over and reported specifically on how the occupation was affecting the Iraqi people. So I got to go see things like the aftermath of when a US patrol would be attacked and soldiers would just start firing randomly at anything that moved. So I got to go see countless Iraqis killed by that random gunfire, and go into the hospitals and see the children and the women and the families left behind when Iraqi men were killed. I got to go into Fallujah and see what happens when the Air Force drops 2,000-pound bombs in urban areas and cluster bombs, and what happens to human beings when they're hit with things like white phosphorus incendiary weapons. And so needless to say, after doing this for about 8 months inside of Iraq, I had a bit of rage against the US military, and specifically against soldiers in the military. War is a very dehumanizing thing, and certainly soldiers are dehumanized when they join the military to enable them to be able to go do things like occupy countries and kill people. But also people on the receiving end of that, Iraqis, people in Afghanistan, and also journalists that cover that side of it, we all become dehumanized by war. And that's what happened to me, to the point where I had so much rage after 8 months of reporting inside of Iraq between 2003 and 2005 that my best case solution of what I thought would happen to be a solution to the occupation of Iraq was basically, everyone in the military needed to be behind bars as soon as possible, regardless of their position. And that was basically the best I could do. I mean, I had severe PTSD. I was completely enraged by what I'd seen, and I couldn't understand how people would join the military and go over and do these things to people in another country. And that was a really hard thing for me to deal with. I had to get PTSD counseling. I had to talk to a lot of people. And thanks to some Vietnam veteran friends of mine, actually, in Vets for Peace, one of them specifically pulled me aside. He took one look at me at a conference and said, "Bubs, you need to start talking to some people, because you're just a walking time bomb." And I was, and that was really the first step for me to start actually getting some empathy for people in the US military who were coming back home from Iraq and now from Afghanistan. Because we're all dehumanized by war, and we all come back with post-traumatic stress disorder, and we all come back with that rage, and we bring it back here to the United States, and we walk around in this country where most people seem fairly oblivious that there's 2 major wars going on in their name and funded by their tax dollars, and it makes you crazy. How do you do this? How do you go eat something? That you can go buy something and you don't have to worry about bombs, and there's electricity and there's clean water. How do you do this after seeing what we've seen over in Iraq? And so I started actually going around on book tour for Beyond the Green Zone, and some vets started showing up at my talks, and I started talking with these fellas. And I started really realizing the gravity of their situation, that when we expand the context a bit and look at the occupations, not only at how they're affecting the Iraqi people or people in Afghanistan, but also people in the US military, I started to see that ultimately people in the US military, most of which had joined for economic reasons or for patriotic reasons or because they really believed they wanted to serve their country, that at the end of the game, because of this US imperial policy in both of these occupations, that soldiers in the US military were ultimately victims as well. Not, of course, on the gravity at which Iraqi people and people in Afghanistan are, but they are also ultimately victims and are paying very, very severe prices for being in the military. So I actually met a guy, it was right after my first book came out, and I flew up to upstate New York to go to a GI coffee house up there at the time called A Different Drummer on the outskirts of Fort Drum. And I flew up to Watertown, and I was picked up by a guy named Phil Aliff. Phil Aliff was a corporal in the Army and served over in Iraq. And as usual, we started talking about, well, when were you there? Where were you? How was it? And Phil started to tell me, well, you know, this is where I was. I was in the Abu Ghraib area outside of Baghdad, and morale was very low. We had guys coming into our unit straight over from tours in Afghanistan, no break, just sent them straight over into Iraq. We were driving around basically waiting to get blown up by roadside bombs. I've heard vets talk about this as the IED lottery, the improvised explosive device lottery, that they're basically just, you know, spinning the roulette wheel every time they go out on patrol, just basically driving around this very volatile area, waiting for all hell to break loose. And he said, so needless to say, morale was very low. Of course, we didn't know why we were there. We knew it was bogus. We didn't know when the hell we were going to get to go home. And so we decided that we would stop doing patrols. So in the military, we've all heard the search and destroy mission moniker. So they renamed it search and avoid missions, which were done very heavily during Vietnam too. But he said, Phil told me what we would do is we would drive out to the end of our patrol route, find a nice big open field, park our Humvees, ideally under some date palms for some shade, and we would have a guy on the radio calling into base every hour saying, yeah, we're still searching the field for weapons caches. We'll talk to you in another hour, because they had to check in every hour. And he said we would smoke cigarettes, drink soda, sometimes if we were lucky, someone would walk by and we'd buy some kebabs from them, and we'd pretend. And I was really shocked. I'd never heard this before. I didn't understand how they could get away with this kind of thing. And I said, well, how often was this happening? And he said, we were doing it every other day. And he said that, you know, just about everybody I knew over there was doing it to some extent or another. And so I filed that away, and then I ran into a fellow named Eli Wright. And Eli Wright, again, was over in Iraq and was talking to me about a similar, almost the exact same story, but at a different location of Iraq in a different time period of the occupation. And Eli Wright, he was a 26-year-old medic when he was deployed over to Iraq into the Ramadi area. And there were other reasons that I started to learn as to why there was resistance in the military and why people were doing things like these search and avoid missions. And Wright, who was stationed in Ramadi from September 2003 until September of the following year, told me, quote, our vehicles had canvas doors and we would put sandbags on the floors. By the end of our tour, we were bolting any metal we could find onto our Humvees. Everyone was doing this. We did not get armored Humvees until much later, until after we left. Then I met a man named Nathan Lewis, who was with the 214th Field Artillery Brigade, and he told me, quote, we never received any training for much of what we were expected to do. We had a white phosphorus mortar round that cooked off in the back of one of our trucks because we loaded that with some other ammo. We were never trained on how to handle it the right way. And stories like this were and are commonplace. Ill-equipped soldiers, not trained to be doing the duties that they were sent out. We've heard of the cooks and the mechanics sent out on patrols, getting into open combat, this kind of thing. So I started running into more and more of that. And so then when Eli Wright went on to tell me, yes, we would actually find overpasses, and we would park our patrols on the tops of overpasses where we had a nice full spectrum view, and we could sit up there with our binos to make sure nobody was going to come attack us. And again, we would call into base, tell them the patrol was going great, and we would smoke our cigarettes and just wait the 8, 12 hours, whatever our patrol was supposed to be, and then head back to base. And this had become commonplace, these search and avoid missions. So much so, then I met a guy named Jeff Millard, who actually was a secretary for a general in both Kuwait and Iraq. And one of his duties when he was in Iraq was to monitor communications for what the military calls SIGACs, or significant actions, which are usually big outbreaks of violence. So whether they involved or didn't involve the U.S. military, he was supposed to monitor these. And then if they involved, if they involved the U.S. military, then his job was to basically alert people to possibly send reinforcements and this kind of thing. And he told me that, normally a patrol there were SIG acts happening all the time, especially in the area he was monitoring, which was central Iraq, Tikrit, Ramadi, Samarra, Diyala province, extremely volatile areas, late 2003 through 2004, early 2005. Extreme, I mean, this is like the center of the resistance in Iraq. He said, so, most units were reporting SIG acts at least every other day. He said, but the thing was, we actually had units that would go 5, 6, 7 months and not report one significant action. He said, so I feel that for sure there were these units that were doing search and avoids on a regular basis. And according to many of my contacts today, while there's overall fewer patrols being run in Iraq today, certainly search and avoid missions are still taking place. But it was interesting to keep talking to these people and to learn more and more of the reasons about why this type of resistance started in Iraq and why it has become so commonplace. Another one that I spoke with is a guy named, a Marine named Brian Kassler, who was in the infantry, and he was deployed to Iraq at the time of the invasion in 2003. After serving in Afghanistan from 2004 to 2005, he was then posted in Iraq. He told me that basically people start covering for each other. Again, talking about search and avoids. He said, I think everyone knows what the hell's going on. A big thing used to be squads putting up in some Iraqi's house for a day or two, just going there and staying. They insert themselves in a house covertly in order to watch a neighborhood without anyone knowing that they were there. But it is really not about watching, it's about sleeping. Hopefully the squad is well equipped and is well accepted in the family. Sometimes they even make friends. A few soldiers keep watch, the rest of the squad gets to catch up on sleep and relax for a change. According to Kassler, there was nothing to be done, no progress to be made there, as he told me. Dissent starts as simple as saying, this is bullshit. Why am I risking my life? First off, Marines always get crapped on, and then the infantry gets crapped on. Our constant refrain was, why are we doing this? All the problems we are facing in Iraq become internalized because people are frustrated but unable to do anything about it. Squabbles and other interpersonal conflicts start happening. The reason I mention this is that it no longer can be ignored that people are just fed up with the situation over there. There is no mission. You are just surviving from day to day with this thought, let us just get home from the deployment, and until that can happen, let us keep our lives as civil as possible. So people end up deciding there just isn't a good enough reason to go out on a mission. It is not worth my sacrifice, not worth my guy's sacrifice. I'm going to declare, I'm setting out on it, I'm going to call it in over the radio, but I'm going to sit here and we are going to chill in this house for the next however long. And that was his mindset. And then there are other creative ways of resistance. Seth Manzel, who is here tonight, actually I spoke with him at length when I was working on my book. He drove Stryker vehicles in the northern cities of Tal Afar and Mosul in Iraq, and he managed to avoid running patrols through computer tampering. He basically figured out a way to manipulate the GPS computer on the Humvees, where, of course, back at the base, all the patrols are monitored, blips on a computer screen, this is where the patrol is. And he, along with several other people I spoke with in the working of this book, figured out how to go into the computer and manipulate the little blip around on the computer screen and make it look like they were moving when they would actually go in and be having tea with some Kurdish Peshmerga or some Iraqi families. And he told me, quote, if you are there and you intend on surviving, then you need to do certain things. And those things aren't always within regulations, and they are not always pleasant or legal. It is just the situation you are put into. When I was a driver, I was extremely aggressive. I ran cars off the road constantly. It was not the right thing to do, but it was the right thing to do to live. After his vehicle was destroyed by another Stryker, interestingly, Manzel became a dismounted machine gunner. He claims his resistance to the occupation grew in direct proportion to the Iraqi resistance, and not because of any high-minded ideals. He insists, no one wants to be the last guy to die for his unit, and it got to that point where it was pretty obvious that if we did our job, that is what we would be. It was better to just go and hide somewhere. Mosul was a dangerous area, and became more so toward the end when we were constantly getting into firefights. I was a vehicle commander at the time, so we would go and drop the dismounted people at some house with an air conditioner where they could kick in a door and hang out and drink tea with those people, while we would proceed with the vehicles and bide time out of visible range. Manziel had figured a way to fabricate on-screen movement of their patrol, as I said, and thereby run virtual missions. Quote, sometimes if they called us up to go and do something, we would swiftly send online reports that show that we were headed in that direction. We would manually move our icon on the map to the location where we were being ordered to go, and we would then move it back and forth to simulate real-time patrolling. And ours was not an isolated case. Everyone did it. Everyone would go and hide somewhere from time to time. It may not have been as regular as in our case, but everyone did it because the workload was just too much to handle, and we were all burnt out. Now, this also is compounded by the fact that everyone in the military is acutely aware of what happens to soldiers when they come back home. And even before that happens, they're acutely aware of how many of them are serving repeated deployments. And we are in a situation right now where I think it's very easy to say that we are in a state of really internal breakdown and possibly even upcoming collapse within the U.S. military. It's so extreme when we look at how many people are being redeployed, how many people are committing suicide, and how either unwilling or unable the Veterans Administration is to help folks when they come back from serving in these occupations. Today, more U.S. war veterans are killing themselves than are dying in open combat while overseas in Iraq and Afghanistan. 1,000 veterans who are receiving care from the Department of Veterans Affairs, the VA, are attempting suicide every single month, and 18 veterans kill themselves every single day. As if surviving their deployment to Iraq or Afghanistan is not enough, upon their return home, soldiers face another battle to obtain the services they are entitled to receive from the VA. A valid discharge from the military, theoretically, entitles all soldiers to medical care from this agency. In the 6 months leading up to March 31st of 2008, however, 1,467 veterans died while waiting to learn whether their disability claims were going to be approved by the U.S. government. Veterans who appeal a VA decision to deny a disability claim must wait an average of nearly 4.5 years for their answer. As of March 25th, 2008, over 287,000 war veterans from the occupations of both Iraq and Afghanistan had filed disability claims with the VA. The deeper one digs, it becomes apparent that the military is in a state of near collapse. We have the retired generals coming on TV from time to time. First it was about Iraq, now it's starting to happen with Afghanistan, claiming how both these occupations are bleeding the military dry. These unsustainable repeated deployments, not enough fresh troops to send in, this has to be stopped. And that really overall hasn't changed. With both occupations, more than 565,000 troops have been deployed more than one time. By December of 2006, it was estimated that 50% of the troops in Iraq were serving their second tour, and another 25% were on their third or fourth tour. It's obviously a very safe assumption to know that these numbers are far, far higher today, particularly with Afghanistan. Compounding things, the military is so overstretched that troops being redeployed often have traumatic brain injury, TBI, which is what happens when you survive a roadside bomb. The concussion from a roadside bomb basically slaps your brain around inside your skull a bit. So they survive a traumatic brain injury, and then they have that injury, but more than 43,000 troops listed as medically unfit have been deployed anyway. Soldiers already diagnosed with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and other severely debilitating mental health conditions that accompany it are being redeployed as the military dredges up troops to keep enough boots on the ground for both occupations. By December of 2007, the Army reported that approximately 12% of combat troops in Iraq and 17% of combat troops in Afghanistan were taking antidepressants and sleeping pills just to cope. I personally have been talking with people more recently. These numbers are really horrific information, but then when you hear the individual stories. About a month ago, I talked with a guy up in Alaska who had a brain tumor and the military were the ones that had diagnosed him with this, and they tried to deploy him to Iraq with a brain tumor. So he had to get a civilian lawyer and fight like hell to not be deployed. He couldn't get out of the military. They made him stay in, but he ended up winning, basically saying, okay, you keep me in the service, but don't deploy me. Let me at least get an operation first. Then I spoke with another guy about 3 weeks ago who had PTSD. The Army were the ones who had diagnosed him with PTSD, and they tried to give him meds and then say, okay, now we're going to send you to Iraq and you can get treatment there. This kind of thing is becoming commonplace. And then, of course, we have suicide. In 2007, the Army reported a record number of suicides. That was a record year for them, only to be surpassed the next year in 2008, another record for suicides in the Army. 2008 was also a record suicide year for active duty Marines. They were killing themselves that year at a rate of 16.8 per 100,000 troops. And then 2009, this year, we're easily on pace to set another grim record of suicides within the Army. And this is getting worse. We had, just within the last couple of months, we had a base in Kentucky, if I remember right, that actually closed itself down. The entire base closed for 2 days because so many suicides were happening on the base and they didn't know what to do about it. So they literally took the entire base offline. Then we have to consider the fact that roughly 1/3 of all the troops in Afghanistan and Iraq are National Guard troops, so much for the 1 weekend a month. Of course, most of these folks are leaving jobs or businesses back home, families, so you can imagine what that does to morale. Attempting to keep enough boots on the ground for both occupations, on June 22, 2006, the Army increased the permissible enlistment age to 42 from a previous limit of 40 years old. This follows a previous rise in the age limit from 35 to 40 in March of 2005. By the summer of 2007, the Army had grown so desperate for recruits that it began to recruit indiscriminately in violation of its own criteria. It accepted individuals with health and weight issues, lower academic test scores, and even those with criminal records. By July of 2007, the number of incoming soldiers with prior felony arrests or convictions had more than tripled over the previous 5 years, and in the first half of 2007, the Army had accepted an estimated 8,000 recruits with rap sheets. They're also actively recruiting from white supremacist groups as well. Again, aside from adding to the breakdown of the military, this isn't exactly going to help things like morale for those who join the military for very honorable and idealistic reasons. And I want to also share a story of a guy named Christopher Goldsmith. I want to read some quotes from him, from his testimony at Winter Soldier, because then this really, his story is a good example of what happens to folks when they come back home, and also incorporating in the issue of stop loss. Stop loss was something that George Bush, we can thank George Bush for. Of course, we can also thank Barack Obama for continuing it. 6% of the troops in Iraq right now are stop lossed, which means you sign up for the military, you sign, say, a 4-year contract, and you serve most of that contract. Maybe that involves a tour or two in one of these occupations. You come back home, you have, say, 1 month to go in your contract, you're wiping your brow, you're almost there. The military comes in and says, well, sorry, you're stop lost, your country needs you, start packing your bags, we're going to send you to Afghanistan. So since September 11, 2001, well over 200,000 soldiers have been stop lost. So after witnessing atrocities in the Sadr City area of Baghdad where he served, Christopher Goldsmith then returned home shattered, only to learn that he was being stop lost to be redeployed back to Iraq. He testified on a panel at Winter Soldier called The Breakdown of the Military, and he gave this account of his story. The moment that I learned that I was stop lost, I swung from being the happiest I had ever been in my life to the most depressed. My joy had come from the sense of relief I felt at the thought of being released from the prison called the Army. When that prospect receded, I experienced the most depressing, most agonizing downward spiral I could imagine anyone going through. I was to be redeployed the same week as I had hoped to be discharged, as per my contract, and that was in May of 2007. The day before I was supposed to deploy, Memorial Day, I went out onto a field in Fort Stewart where there's a memoriam a tree planted for every soldier in the 3rd Infantry Division that has died. I went out among those fallen soldiers and tried to take my own life. I took pills, and I went back to my regular poison of vodka, and I drank until I couldn't drink anymore. The next thing I knew, I was handcuffed to a gurney in the hospital. The cops had found me and literally dragged my body into an ambulance, threw me in there, and locked me up. I spent a week in a mental ward. Now, mind you, I was diagnosed because I had finally sought mental health treatment. I thought I was having a heart attack. I believed myself to be strong, but on hearing I was stop-lost, I started having panic attacks, and I couldn't admit that I was mentally or emotionally broken. So I went into the hospital complaining of chest pain, and they had me seek a mental health professional. They diagnosed me with depression and anxiety disorder and adjustment disorder. But I was still set to be deployed, obviously a broken soldier, but still set to deploy. His ordeal did not end there. He ultimately obtained a general discharge from the military, but the papers cited the reasons for discharge as, quote, misconduct, serious offense. The irony was not lost when Goldsmith went on to say, my serious offense was trying to kill myself because I was so damaged by the war, the occupation in Iraq. It was misconduct for me not to get on the flight while I was being chained or handcuffed to a bed in the hospital. So I lost my college benefits, the one thing that had really given me hope in life that I was looking for. You know, I was going to be a student. I didn't know where, I didn't know what I was going to study, but I knew I was going to college in September of 2007. And that didn't happen. My money is disappearing now between VA visits and personal instability. I found it extremely hard to find a job. To tell you the truth, I haven't really looked because I've been having a rough time. So I deliver pizzas on Wednesdays. That's what I am now, a pizza delivery boy. I was a sergeant, I was a leader, I was a trainer, I was very well thought of. I was one of the most professional soldiers. I mean, I got the paperwork right here in front of me if anyone ever wants to see the proof that I was a very good soldier. But now I'm a pizza delivery boy who works once a week because that's the only job where I can call in a couple of hours before and say, I'm still at the VA, I'm waiting in line, I'm sorry I can't come in for a couple of hours. I interviewed Goldsmith shortly after his testimony. He told me, quote, war is a really destructive thing. It follows you home and it doesn't go away. And that story illustrates what does it mean when we've had over 2 million people now cycled through both occupations in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so many of these people are coming back home and having similar experiences to Christopher Goldsmith. And what's going to happen with these people? And then further down the road, what is that going to do to this country? Another thing that is indicative of a breakdown in the military, and this is not a new thing, it's rape and sexual assault in the U.S. military. This has been happening since the Revolutionary War. As I said, it's been going on for a long time, as long as this country's had a military, but it's really reached proportions today that arguably I don't think have ever been reached before in the U.S. military. For example, if we look at overall statistics, according to the VA, of all the female soldiers being treated at the VA, 20% admit to having been raped or sexually assaulted while serving in the U.S. military. Also, to accompany that statistic, we have another report from the Pentagon that has showed us that 80% of all women who are raped or sexually assaulted in the military never report it. So we can't hold those up to each other and say, okay, that means 100% of the people in the military, of the women, are going to be raped or sexually assaulted. But we can hold those up next to one another and see very, very clearly that the rate is far, far, far higher than the 20% that we know of for sure. And when I was working on this book, all the women that I spoke with basically verified this. If they hadn't been raped or sexually assaulted, virtually every one of them that I spoke with knew someone that had. One woman that I spoke with actually didn't serve in Iraq or Afghanistan. Her name was April Fitzsimmons. She served in the Air Force from 1985 to 1989 as an intelligence analyst and an intelligence briefer for a 2-star general. But early on in her career, she was sexually assaulted by another soldier, and she described her experience in the aftermath of that in the military and her overall analysis of this system in the military, which is, of course, an extremely misogynistic kind of social organism, and how it perpetuates itself, and how it continues forward and really enables this, A, to happen, and then B, to continue to happen over time. Quote, "When victims come forward, they are ostracized, doubted, and isolated from their communities. They are punished." She told me that many of the perpetrators are officers who, quote, "use their ranks to coerce women to sleep with them. On being asked, all they have to do is deny it, after which they are reprimanded and sent away. It's a closely interwoven community, so the perpetrators are safe within the system and can fearlessly move free amongst their victims. The crisis is so severe that I'm telling women to simply not join the military because it's completely unsafe and puts them at risk. Until something changes at the top, no woman should join the military." Back in January 2006, I was asked to provide testimony at a U.S. War Crimes in Iraq Commission of Inquiry for crimes against humanity committed by the Bush administration. It was in New York, and it was there that I met General Janice Karpinski. General Karpinski had since been demoted to colonel because she was actually a general at Abu Ghraib when the scandalous photos were released, and she was one of the people, despite the fact that she had written proof that Rumsfeld had been giving the orders for this type of behavior, she was one of the higher-ranking people to actually take the fall for what went on in that prison. She, though, at this particular commission, was talking specifically about shocking revelations about Lieutenant General Ricardo Sanchez, who was the former U.S. military commander of all of Iraq, where he was basically hiding the fact that the cause of death of several female American soldiers had something to do with rape and sexual assault, and was actively covering it up. And again, this is the head general in charge of the situation in Iraq for a time. Karpinski at this commission testified specifically about a coalition joint task force surgeon who said in a briefing that women soldiers had died of dehydration in the 130-degree heat. And that was because they refused to drink liquids in the latter part of the day because they were reluctant to use the latrines, which were located outside of their barracks, because they have to go outside their barracks after dark. And it was there that they had fear being sexually assaulted or raped by male soldiers. Generators at the camp were apparently loud enough to muffle the sound of the women's screams as male soldiers jumped them and dragged them and sexually assaulted them. Speaking specifically of Lieutenant General Ricardo S. Sanchez, who was commander of all coalition forces in Iraq from June 03 to June 04, Karpinski said, quote, "Rather than make everybody aware of that, because that's shocking, and as a leader, if that's not shocking to you, then you're not much of a leader, what they told the surgeon is, don't brief those details anymore. And don't say specifically that they're women. You can provide that in a written report, but don't brief it out in the open anymore." Just before that, Karpinski gave a talk at the Thomas Jefferson School of Law in October of 2005, talking about sexual assaults in Iraq and their cover-up. She said then, quote, "It was out of control. An 800 number existed as a helpline for women to use to report sexual assaults, but no one had a phone, and no one answered the number, which was based in the United States. She informed the audience at that time that more than 80 incidents were reported during a 6-month period alone in Iraq and Kuwait, and the rape hotline was still being answered by a machine that told callers to leave a message. Quote, "There were innumerable such situations all over the theater of operations, Iraq and Kuwait, because female soldiers didn't have a voice individually or collectively. Even as a general, I didn't have a voice with Sanchez, so I know what the soldiers were facing. Sanchez did not want to hear about female soldier requirements and or issues." Karpinski then quoted Sanchez as saying, "The women asked to be here, so now let them take what comes with the territory." In response to that, April Fitzsimmons, that I spoke of, and several other women have formed a group called Service Women's Action Network. This is a group of veterans or active duty female soldiers who have taken it upon themselves to do what they can to fight against this extremely high incidence of rape and sexual assault in the military. So one woman that I spoke with, her story is in the book, Marisa Leguzman, said one of the things she likes to do is, around the LA area where she was living at the time, she liked to go into high schools and talk to students, and specifically girls, high school girls, about joining the military and share her experience of being sexually assaulted in the military. And when I asked her, approximately how many girls do you figure you've talked to so far doing this work, she said, I think it's somewhere over about 30,000 now. So we do have a lot of pushback happening on that front, and I would expect that to increase. There's other ways of resistance in the military as well. There's art as resistance. There's people coming back, Iraq Veterans Against the War, holding winter soldier hearings nationally, regionally. We've had one up here in Seattle just last summer. So there are other ways of speaking out: organized resistance, GI resistance houses like veterans houses, GI resistance coffee houses, and then I have another chapter in the book called Cyber Resistance, where troops have active duty as well as folks who've already been discharged are keeping blogs and trying to share their stories online and get them out to a wider audience, of course, when we continue to have a military that, for whatever reasons, won't cover the story. One of these individuals is a former Marine who served in Fallujah in Iraq. His name is Adam Kokesh. He has a blog called Revolutionary Patriot, where he's written about being personally assaulted by undercover FBI agents in Washington, D.C. He has videos and photos of this, about his thoughts on the Democratic and Republican national conventions in 2008, as well as his own experiences in dealing with his own post-traumatic stress disorder. Not a shy man, Kokesh did not hesitate to upload on his blog a video of his speech during a march in Washington, D.C., where he is seen exhorting a very boisterous crowd, saying, quote, "The time is now, the threat is clear, the bands of tyranny are tightening around America. It is our duty to resist." Kokesh was part of a team of vets who met with Representative John Conyers in July of 2008 to push Conyers to file the articles of impeachment against George W. Bush. In a video of the meeting posted on his blog, Kokesh used his time at the microphone to tell Conyers, who was still undecided about filing the articles of impeachment, quote, "And I get the feeling that what you're doing and what the Democratic Party is doing is telling this country, as we are being bled dry by tyrants, that we're just going to be okay, that the only promises we get from Democrats are Band-Aids over these far deeper wounds that anyone is willing to admit to publicly. I hear one of the arguments against impeachment that it would harm the Democrats in the upcoming elections. And I hope that you realize, because you didn't communicate this when I asked you the question, that there are real consequences to not impeaching that are far, far worse than not having Democrats in the Congress or Senate or a Democrat in the White House in the next election. You said you've made thousands of decisions, many of them very respectable, many of them very courageous. But by your own admission, it seems that what is holding you back from this one is your own indecision. You said that I might be surprised by your plans. You haven't put forth any, and frankly, I'm not surprised." Aside from blogging, testifying to representatives, leading marches, and getting arrested, Kokesh has participated in Operation First Casualty, OFC, a tactic of street theater in which vets don their camouflage and take to the streets of U.S. cities to carry out public patrols, realistic mock arrests, home raids, and tower watches to raise awareness of both occupations. After an OFC action on March 19, 2007, the 4th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq, Kokesh received an email from the Marine Corps Mobilization Command that oversees the individual ready reserve to which Kokesh reported at the time. The email accused him of violating the Uniform Code of Military Justice, the UCMJ, by wearing his uniform during a political event. Quote, "I was like, wait a second, I'm in the IRR. The UCMJ doesn't apply. This is bullshit," he said. The scathing response that Kokesh set back also was posted on his blog. It concluded, "I fail to see how reminding me of my, quote, obligations and responsibilities," end quote, that helps you achieve either of these. It seems that while accomplishing our mission in Iraq, every corner we turn sends us further down the spiral, but there is still much that you can do to bring our fellow Marines home alive, he wrote. So no, I am not replying to your email in order to acknowledge my understanding of my obligations and responsibilities, but rather to ask you to please, kindly, go fuck yourself. In the chain of events that followed, the military threatened to give him a less than honorable discharge, which would affect his education benefits, but so far the military has not followed through. Kokesh has gone on to do other things, like if you go online to YouTube and watch John McCain's riveting speech at the Republican National Convention, you'll see he's interrupted, I think it's 3 times, because there's someone way back in the back rafters of the Coliseum that several times started chanting to end the occupation and to take care of veterans, and was holding up a sign. And then the crowd, of course, would start doing very intelligent things like chanting "Drill, baby, drill," and "USA, USA, USA" to drown him out, while John McCain kind of stood there and looked on powerlessly until a couple of thugs could get Kokesh and wrestle him down the steps and take him out of the Coliseum. So there is resistance like that happening as well. There's more and more resistors starting to stand up and refuse orders to deploy to both Iraq and Afghanistan. Here in Seattle, we have Lieutenant Aaron Watada, who back in 2006 became the highest ranking member He became the highest ranking member of the U.S. military to publicly refuse a combat deployment to Iraq. And he did so on the grounds that he felt as a soldier it was his moral duty to not follow an illegal order. And what Lieutenant Watada did, and I think it really shook the military quite a bit at the time, was he was literally following his oath as a soldier to a T. An oath that, as a soldier, says you will support and defend the Constitution of the United States by following lawful orders. So what Watada was going to do was put the war on trial in his court-martial and say, look, the invasion and occupation of Iraq violates the UN Charter. Because according to the UN Charter, there's only 2 reasons why a country is allowed to go to war, i.e. 2 reasons to have a just war. 1, with a UN Security Council ratification, and 2, in an act of self-defense. And so Watada's lawyer and he himself were going to argue in the court-martial things along the lines that since the invasion and occupation of Iraq violated international law, it also violated the U.S. Constitution, because there's a thing in the U.S. Constitution, Article 6, Paragraph 2, called the Supremacy Clause, that says any foreign treaty the U.S. government signs then becomes the supreme law of our land, therefore superseding all state, local law, and federal. That law becomes our law. So by definition, any soldier going to Iraq would violate both international law and the U.S. Constitution. Therefore, when we come back to the oath they swore when they were sworn in as a soldier to support and defend the Constitution of the United States by following lawful orders, they would break their own oath as a soldier to deploy to Iraq. That was what Watada argued, and of course they went on with the court-martial, and the judge threw the court-martial. In an act of brilliance, what the judge tried to do was make it illegal for Watada in the defense to use really crazy radical words like Iraq and war and occupation. And the judge at one point basically talked himself into a corner where he had to use one of those words, so he declared a mistrial. And of course forgot about this little thing called double jeopardy, that you can't try somebody twice for the same thing. So then Aaron Watada went on to sit behind a desk for a very long time. But at that time in 2006, it was a very magical time, because I was actually very lucky to have been at a Veterans for Peace National Convention that was up here in Seattle, and I got to hear Lieutenant Watada speak out of uniform at that event. And I'd like to quote him at length, because I think what Lieutenant Aaron Watada did at that day, and one reason the military decided to try to throw the book at him the best they could, was he really outlined a blueprint of what would need to happen in order to have a real GI resistance movement in this country today. Because we look at the situation, this is a country with a very rich history of GI resistance. During Vietnam, for example, we had a GI resistance movement that was extremely powerful. Of course, that was coalesced with a very powerful and vibrant anti-war movement here at home. But arguably, the GI resistance movement in Vietnam helped bring that war to an end, coupled with a very fierce Vietnamese resistance. But for example, part of the GI resistance movement during Vietnam was even within the U.S. Navy. During Operation Rolling Thunder, when the U.S. really upped the aerial bombardment of Vietnam and Cambodia, soldiers, disgruntled sailors in the ships themselves that were launching the aircraft to go do these bombing runs, at one point, by sabotage, took 2 of the U.S.'s 14 aircraft carrier groups completely offline. And then by the end of the Vietnam War, just about half the soldiers on the ground literally would not follow orders. So when you have a military that basically half of them are giving the government the finger, it makes it pretty hard for the government to fight a war. And what Lieutenant Watada did during his speech is he really outlined what would need to happen in this country if we were going to see a modern day iteration of a GI resistance movement. And what he said was this: "Today I speak with you about a radical idea. It is one born from the very concept of the American soldier or service member. It became instrumental in ending the Vietnam War, but it has been long since forgotten. And that idea is this, that to stop an illegal and unjust war, the soldiers can choose to stop fighting it. For soldiers to resist," he said, "is not an easy task, but it is of utmost importance that they hold themselves responsible for their actions and remember their civic duties and supersede the ideologies of their leadership. The soldiers must be willing to face ostracism by their peers, concern over the survival of their families, and of course the loss of personal freedom. They must know that resisting an authoritarian government at home is equally important to fighting a foreign aggressor on the battlefield. Finally, those wearing the uniform must know beyond any shadow of a doubt that by refusing immoral and illegal orders, they will be supported by the people not with mere words, but by action." Through his words and actions, Watada was obviously posing a very big threat to the U.S. military. He went on to specifically address several issues that face U.S. soldiers. He said, quote, "They must realize that this is a war not out of self-defense, but by choice for profit and imperialistic domination." Words, of course, that apply equally so to Afghanistan today. He went on, "They must consider the lies used to justify the invasion and occupation of Iraq. WMD, ties to al-Qaeda, and ties to 9/11 never existed and never will. The soldier must know that our narrowly and questionably elected officials intentionally manipulated the evidence presented to Congress, the public, and the world to make the case for war. Though the American soldier wants to do right, the illegitimacy of the occupation itself, the policies of the administration, and rules of engagement of desperate field commanders will ultimately force them to be a party to war crimes. They must know some of these facts, if not all, in order to act." He went on to emphasize that enlisting in the military does not absolve one from the responsibility of distinguishing between right and wrong. This is an extremely important point because people in the military, and I think most people in U.S. society, believe that when you join the military, you basically sign on the dotted line and that's it. All you do from then on out is follow orders. You never question anything. If you question anything, it's unpatriotic and you're going to be punished, and probably severely. This is not true. Watada went on, "I was only following orders is never an excuse. The Nuremberg trial showed America and the world that citizenry, as well as soldiers, have the unrelinquishable obligation to refuse complicity in war crimes perpetrated by their government. Widespread torture and inhumane treatment of detainees is a war crime. A war of aggression born through an unofficial policy of prevention is a crime against peace. An occupation violating the very essence of international humanitarian law and sovereignty is a crime against humanity. These crimes are funded by our tax dollars. Should citizens choose to remain silent through self-imposed ignorance or choice, he argued, it makes them as culpable as the soldier in these crimes. When we say, against all enemies, foreign and domestic, what if elected leaders become the enemy? Whose orders do we follow then? The answer is the conscience that lies in each soldier, each American, and each human being. If we want soldiers to choose the right but difficult path, they must know beyond any shadow of a doubt that they will be supported by Americans. To support the troops who resist, you must make your voices heard. If they see thousands supporting me, they will know. I have heard your support, as has Suzanne Swift and Ricky Klausing, but many others have not. Increasingly, more soldiers are questioning what they are being asked to do. Yet the majority lack awareness of the truth that is buried beneath the headlines. Many more see no alternative but to obey. We must show open-minded soldiers a choice, and we must give them the courage to act. You must know that to stop this war, for the soldiers to stop fighting it, they must have the unconditional support of the people. I have seen this support with my own eyes. For me, it was a leap of faith, but for other soldiers, they do not have that luxury. They must know it, and you must show it to them. Convince them that no matter how long they sit in prison, no matter how long this country takes to right itself, their families will have a roof over their heads, food in their stomachs, opportunities, and education. This is a daunting task. It requires the sacrifice of all of us. Why must Canadians feed and house our fellow Americans who have chosen to do the right thing? We should be the ones taking care of our own. Are we that powerless? Are we that unwilling to risk something for those who can truly end this war? How do you support the troops but not the war? By supporting those who can truly stop it. Let them know that resistance to participate in an illegal war is not futile and not without a future. He then concluded, "Now I'm not a hero. I am a leader of men who said, enough is enough. Those who called for war prior to the invasion compared diplomacy with Saddam Hussein to the compromises made with Hitler. I say, we compromise now by allowing a government that uses war as the first option instead of the last to act with impunity. Many have said this about the World Trade Towers. Never again. I agree. Never again will we allow those who threaten our way of life to reign free, be they terrorists or elected officials. The time to fight back is now. The time to stand up and be counted is today." And we got the news 2 days ago that Aaron Watada is now going to be released this Friday from the military. Now, when you hear this information over time, it kind of loses its impact, because here's a guy that after the military blew his court-martial, they basically put him behind a desk at Fort Lewis and had him move papers around on a desk from that period in 2007 up until right now. So it kind of lost some of the impact of what actually happened. But at the end of the day, what we have here is Lieutenant Aaron Watada, the highest person to publicly refuse a combat deployment, the highest ranked person to publicly refuse a combat deployment to Iraq, will at the end of the day not spend one day in Iraq nor one day in jail. This sets a very important precedent for others to follow, and others are following. I've covered two recent stories of two soldiers from Fort Hood in Killeen, Texas. Fort Hood is the largest base in the country, I believe. It's also the most heavily deployed. The first of these was a man named Specialist Victor Augusto. Specialist Augusto had served a tour in Iraq, and over there basically became wise to what the occupation was all about. As he told me, I was watching contractors make obscene amounts of money. I didn't really see any reason for us to be there. He started to be punished by the military then, because he actually, once he returned back home, said, okay, you're ordering me now to go to Afghanistan and I'm not going to go. I cannot in good conscience go support this illegal occupation. He was, of course, educating himself on the illegality of Afghanistan for the same reasons that Iraq is illegal. And he then, the Army kept upping the ante, and then eventually it became very clear he was going to be court-martialed and face upwards to a year in a military brig for his public refusal to deploy to Afghanistan. And I spoke with him right before his trial and said, look, you're about to get the hammer dropped on you. You're going to get probably a year in prison. You're going to lose most, if not all, of your pay. You'll have your rank reduced. You'll probably get a dishonorable discharge. It'll make it hard for you to find a job. Do you have regrets? Do you still really feel solid that what you're doing is the right thing? He said, yes, I'm fully prepared for this. I have concluded that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are not going to be ended by politicians or people at the top. The politicians and the people at the top are not responsive to the regular people. They're responsive to corporate America. The only way to make them responsive to the needs of the people is for soldiers to not fight their wars. If soldiers don't fight their wars, the wars won't happen. I hope I'm setting an example for other soldiers. And he did. He was court-martialed. It was reduced. It ended up not being a year. It ended up being 25 days in a county jail. Victor Augusto's free, and last I talked to him, he's headed up this way to start campaigning for a guy named Sergeant Travis Bishop. Because a week after Victor Augusto's court-martial, Sergeant Travis Bishop, who had also served a tour in Iraq and then came back and also realized, look, I'm opposed to all war. My religious beliefs tell me that I have to be opposed to all war. And he didn't know that this thing called conscientious objector status and the ability for soldiers to apply for it still actually existed. And it does. He, like most other people in the military, believed it was some leftover thing from Vietnam. You couldn't still actually do that. But it does, of course, still exist. Anyone in the U.S. military today, at any moment, can apply and file for conscientious objector status. The military has to walk them through this process. And at the end, if it's approved, then they get an honorable discharge with all their benefits. So Sergeant Travis Bishop realized, look, these occupations are illegal, and also they're contrary to my personal religious and spiritual beliefs. I'm opposed to all war. I'm going to file for conscientious objector status. The military, of course, court-martialed him, and he, too, then was sentenced to some time in jail, but unlike Victor Augusto, he wasn't so lucky. Clearly, the military decided to make an example out of him. I sat through his court-martial, actually heard the judge say something at the very beginning of the trial along the lines of, if you file for conscientious objector status and are successful in that, well, maybe everybody in the military is going to want to file for conscientious objector status. That was the judge that said that. Yeah, it'd be a good idea. But that was the judge that said that, right? An impartial judge. I think he was a major. And then, of course, we had the jury of peers, the lowest of which was at least 6 ranks higher than Sergeant Travis Bishop. So, needless to say, the court-martial was a farce. It was a kangaroo court. I think it's over 95% of military court-martials result in a conviction. So, Sergeant Travis Bishop was given a year in jail, forfeited 2/3 of his pay, and had his rank reduced to private. And then when he's released, I believe he will get a dishonorable discharge. And he spent a short time in the county jail at Killeen outside of Fort Hood, and then was recently transferred to Fort Lewis, right here in Washington State, where he sits now. And again, I talked with him right before they put the manacles on him and gave him the military escort with MPs out to the van to whisk him off away to the jail. And he was scared. He was really shaken up. He said, yeah, I'm scared. Who wants to go to jail? We've all heard the stories. It's not a nice place. But I asked him, well, is it still worth it to you? You're going to jail. You're going to be alone. You don't know what's going to happen. And he said, yeah, absolutely, it's worth it to me. I can sleep with myself at night with a clear conscience, knowing that I did the right thing. And like Victor Augusto, he said, I hope, again, that I'm setting an example for other soldiers to follow. And other soldiers are following. If we look at overall broader numbers within the military, we've had over 55,000 troops since 2000 from all branches of the military go absent without leave. We've had, in the Army alone, from 2006 to 2007, we've seen a 42% increase in the number of troops going absent without leave. And then support groups, advocacy groups for troops who are going, standing up and making public refusals to deploy are seeing massive increases in the number of people contacting them. There's a group called Courage to Resist down in Oakland, and I spoke with them a few months ago about how many calls they were getting about, from soldiers who were going to make public stands, and they said that they had seen a 200% increase in the number of calls they were receiving in just the last couple of months alone. So it is spreading, it is happening, and more soldiers are coming into the ranks of the Lieutenant Aaron Watadas, the Specialist Victor Augustos, and the Sergeant Travis Bishops, who are saying, I'm not going to participate in either of these occupations. They're both illegal, they both violate international and domestic law, and I'm not going to be a part of that, and I'm not going to be a party to war crimes. And so that brings me to this conclusion, that I simply want to reiterate this blueprint that Aaron Watada lined out, because we're in a situation now that if you talk to any of these soldiers who are refusing, they will tell you, look, 90% of the guys in my unit feel exactly the same as me, but they won't stand up, mostly because they can't afford to lose their job, because it's the only job in town, or they've got a family to support, all these reasons, or they're near the end of their contract and they're just sitting there hoping not to get stop lost. So the point is, if you can find these people, they're all around us, they're in our communities, they're coming back, they're going back into colleges, there's still potential military resources that can be tapped and brought back in to redeploy to one of these occupations. But as a community, if you can find these people, find one of these people and say, look, if you stand up, we in this community have got your back. We will support your family. We will cover medical bills. We will help them with their education while you're in the brig. We will help you find a pro bono lawyer. We will help you resist. If communities start to do that, we will start to see more and more people stand up, and we will start to see the formation of a modern day GI resistance movement. And that is what organizations like Coffee Strong Coffee House plays such a key, important role, because these are places where soldiers are actually going in, and this is where you find these folks. And they go in there and they talk to lawyers, and they can get PTSD counseling, and they can commiserate with other soldiers, and they're there and they're very easy to find. So any of you who are very serious about ending both of these occupations, I really can't think of a better way than to find these soldiers, and even if we find one person, if you as a community find one person and help them stand up and resist going to these wars, and they don't have to go, you're literally saving at least one life of one U.S. military person, as well as countless lives of Iraqis or people in Afghanistan, depending on where they would be deployed. And if that is not honorable, just work and truly supporting the troops, then I don't know what is. And I feel like when we look at these guys who are, and women who are willing to lay it all on the line, go to jail, lose their money, lose their benefits, lose the esteem of all their peers in the military, simply because it's the right thing to do, what excuse do we have not to throw all the support that we have behind these people who can truly stop these wars? Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks very much. And this is Seth Manzel, who I mentioned in the talk, and he's with Coffee Strong, pretty much the man behind the mission, and he's going to talk to you for a little bit.
So, for those of you who aren't aware of what we're doing at Coffee Strong, we are a GI coffee house. We're located just outside the gates of Fort Lewis, the area that we operate in, is full of soldiers every day, although that number has gone down pretty steeply because of the recent deployments out of Fort Lewis. What we offer soldiers is GI rights counseling, military sexual trauma counseling for the soldiers who suffer the abuses that Dahr had spoken about. We have concerts for soldiers. All our concerts are, we usually charge something at the door, but it's always free for soldiers. We give free drip coffee for soldiers, and we provide links to mental health and help them out with all their problems that they're facing as soldiers. Recently, we've seen an unprecedented number of soldiers deployed from Iraq. We had 3 brigades deploy from Iraq, 3 infantry brigades, which constituted about 60% of the population of the base. The base is almost depopulated, save a few units left behind, and the support people left behind who are running operations in the rear. So the revenue that we normally depend on from sales from the coffee shop has gone down pretty steeply. At the same time, we're seeing people. Well, right now we're seeing soldiers coming back in coffins from these deployments already. They've only been gone for a couple months, but we're starting to see people filter back in who are wounded. We're going to see more and more of these people, people who are just no longer able to function as soldiers for mental reasons, filtering back in, and who are going to be needing our resources, in spite of the fact that as a business we're not doing a whole lot. So I also want to talk about Travis Bishop was sentenced to a year in prison, and he's going to be serving, or is serving that time at Fort Lewis. For the first couple weeks that he was there, he was held completely incommunicado and was deprived of his access to his attorneys. This was a pretty egregious violation of his rights. And we also have another person who is a resistor who is also from Fort Hood, Leo Church, being held at Fort Lewis. He joined the Army, went to basic training, and then after basic training went to the vocational training that he needed for his military specialty, that he was going to be a radio operator of some sort. But while he was doing this vocational training, he found out that his family was homeless and living on the streets, and he approached his chain of command to let them know that, hey, my family's homeless, I need time off so I can go and take care of this, and he was told flat out no, he had to complete his training. So he made a decision and went AWOL to get his family off the streets and bring them back to Fort Hood. Of course, there's nowhere for his family to stay there, and when he was arrested for being AWOL, he was sentenced to a year in jail as well. And his wife, who was pregnant at the time, had to give up the baby that she was carrying for adoption because he wasn't getting paid as a soldier, and they were completely unable to take care of the child. So Leo Church is being held there as well. Both Leo and Travis know each other. They're being held, they speak while they're in jail, and they have the same lawyer who's representing them. When they speak to their lawyer on the phone, their calls are monitored by guards. This is another violation of attorney-client privilege. That doesn't end when you're in the military. You're still entitled to that sort of thing. And so both of these, and also money has been sent for them to live in prison. You have to buy shaving things, some food items, things like that. And that money is completely unaccounted for. Mail that's been going to them has been unaccounted for. So both of these guys are being treated very poorly while they're in, and we really need to get the community out and get them working in protesting outside a base and putting pressure on the commanders there on Fort Lewis to treat these people right, and also they're going to be filing appeals, so hopefully we'll have some actions around that. But what we would really like is for groups here in Seattle to send representatives down on Wednesday, October the 7th at 7 p.m. So that we can have a meeting and talk about the actions that are going to be coming up here very soon. So if all of you could take that back to your respective groups and hopefully send someone down to Coffee Strong. I know that's a long drive for folks in Seattle, but we'd really like to see you down there. But I want to thank you all for coming out, and hopefully Dahr can, I'd like to thank Dahr for coming out, and hopefully he can answer some questions if we have any time left. And definitely buy his book. They're for sale out there on the table when you leave. But I just want to tell you one thing about, I was working the other day, and a woman came into the coffee shop, and she was a soldier, and she rolled up her sleeve and showed me a scar on her shoulder and said that she had us to thank for it. What had happened was she was a military police officer and was sent to Afghanistan, and the military police people oftentimes find themselves in combat. It's one of the few MOSs that a woman will regularly find herself in combat or be deliberately put into combat in. But her truck was blown up by an IED, and her arm was completely unusable as a result of it. She had severe damage to her shoulder. She was not treated while she was in Afghanistan and had to stay there in Afghanistan for the rest of the deployment with an arm that was not working properly. She couldn't fire a weapon properly, she couldn't wear body armor properly, but they kept her there in spite of that. Once she got back to the States, they still were not treating her, they still were not giving her the medical attention she needed, but she came to us, she got GI rights counseling, and she was pointed in the right direction, how to put pressure on the military to get her the health care she needed, and was actually given a civilian doctor who performed the operation, and now she's able to use her right arm again. So this is just one example of the many things that we're doing at Coffee Strong, and I hope you can all find time to find some way that you can support us, either by coming out to events like this or volunteering or any number of other ways. So. Thank you all so much, and I hope Dahr can answer some questions.
This form is out front, right here. You can become a monthly sustainer. There's different amounts here, or you can enter other. You can give them check. They'd probably take cash. I think the dollar's still worth something, at least for now. So you could use dollars. And then there's other ways, too, to go support that. They have a table out there. Seth's going to be out there. Go up after the Q&A session and ask him specifically if you can't afford to give money, and they really, really need money right now. Of course, it's tough times for everybody. Thanks to the wonderfully functioning free market we live in, we're all feeling the pinch. But Coffee Strong literally cannot do this work without community support. It's where they're getting all of the funding, or at least most of the funding is from us. So $5, $10, anything you can do is going to help. These are out front. Pick one up. You can give them money right there, or there's an address where you can send in a check, or you can put a credit card number, and it'll just take automatic monthly payments from it as well. So absolutely, this is a GI Strong Coffee House support event. This is all about trying to bring as much support as we can to this coffee house. It's one of only 2 left standing now in the country. We're hoping that others will pop up around the country and follow suit. But like what Seth said, they're doing really active work in helping people in the military that have other problems, as well as giving support to people who are going to refuse to deploy to both of these illegal and immoral occupations. So give anything that you can. Nothing is too small to help support Coffee Strong. That's why we're here. And with that, we'll go into some questions and answers. The question is, what exactly are troops doing in the occupations? And I haven't reported from Afghanistan, so I'll talk first about Iraq from my own personal experience, and then talk a little bit about Afghanistan based on what I'm reading and what some of my friends who are reporting from over there are telling me. And regarding Iraq, like I said, most often folks are kind of either sitting in their bases, as they're doing now, where we're seeing a massive consolidation of fewer patrols, but we still do have tons of patrols going around in cities. We still do have some bases in the cities, but overall there's fewer, and so more people are kind of, the forward operating bases, the combat support bases are kind of being consolidated into the bigger mega bases, because we're going to have, right now it looks like a minimum of 6 mega bases in Iraq. For example, one of them is called Camp Anaconda in Balad. There's over actually 35,000 troops at that one base alone. We still have over 131,000 troops in Iraq. So a lot of them are basically just hanging out in bases. But then there are still patrols being carried out. They're basically patrols that most of the folks I talked to said, look, these are basically show patrols. We're not actually helping the Iraqi people. We're actually not helping bring security to them. We're certainly not helping bring security to ourselves. So we're basically driving around waiting to get blown up. In Afghanistan, on the other hand, really they're fighting, again, it's another guerrilla war where they're fighting a Taliban that is like the resistance in Iraq, can basically show up, launch attacks, and then fade back into the civilian population. And historically, when you use a conventional military to try to fight a guerrilla war, like in Vietnam, you're basically not going to win, because you can't identify the enemy, you can't go out and attack bases, you can't raid headquarters and things like this. So what we see in Afghanistan now is the U.S. military generally can't move a convoy or patrol more than 12 miles in a day, because they get attacked so much. They basically can't move at night, because Taliban now controls about 2/3 of Afghanistan. So that's what we're looking at there. And then, just so that we're real clear earlier on numbers, we'll have 69,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan by the end of this year. Right now, McChrystal is meeting with Admiral Mullen at a base in Germany, asking for upwards of 45,000 more troops. And I think that this probably won't be the last time we see another escalation of troops. I heard he's going to get an other than honorable discharge. I think that's what I read today, which basically means it's something between an honorable discharge, which means you get discharged and you have all your medical benefits and retirement and everything that you were promised with your contract. But then like a dishonorable discharge, for example, like what Travis Bishop will get, basically means you get nothing. You don't get retirement pay, you don't get VA access, any of this stuff. So he's getting something in between. So I don't know what the specifics are, but he does maintain some benefits, and it's not a big giant black mark on his resume as if it was going to be a dishonorable discharge. I'm really glad you asked that. A colleague of mine, a woman named Sarah Lazare, she works down at Courage to Resist in Oakland, and we did a story that we published on Tom Englehart's website, tomdispatch.com, a ways back, about a unit called Echo Platoon. Now, I'm going to talk to you about Echo Platoon, and this is a longer answer to your question, but this is a really important story, and I think one that we're going to hear a lot more about soon, especially once this official, whether it's 30 or 45,000 or however many troops starts happening. Echo Platoon is part of the 82nd Airborne. It's at Fort Bragg in North Carolina. And Echo Platoon is made up of a group of between 50 and 60 soldiers. Most of them are folks who have gone AWOL and either turned themselves back in or been caught and then sent to this, they call them also a holdover unit. There's also people in this unit that have severe PTSD or other mental health issues, and they're not able to get treatment from the military. Basically, the military medicates them up on all these different psychotropic meds and then just kind of throws them in here to sit. And where these people were is it was basically like an old rundown barracks. There were 4 to 6 of these people per room. 50 guys were sharing one latrine. They weren't allowed to go more than 50 miles off post. They didn't really have anything to do. They'd have them do things like cut grass and pick weeds, but they didn't really have things to do. And the worst part was they didn't have a discharge date. They wouldn't court-martial them, so they didn't have a court date. They were basically in this kind of limbo land, and the military was just letting them sit there. And then what they would do is about once a month, a commander would come by and say, you know, this AWOL thing, we'll forget about it if you go to Afghanistan. And from what all these folks that we talked to were telling us was that about half the people in there would eventually break and take a deployment, because then they felt, well, at least then theoretically I should be able to go home after a deployment. So they're getting troops from places like this, and that's where some of these people I talked about who had PTSD and they're trying to deploy them anyway, that's where these folks are coming from a lot of the time. And so we published this story. The day after we published it, the military condemned the building that Echo Platoon was in because it was that bad, and they broke them up and put them in other places, and then they sentenced like 10 of the guys. So they basically tried to break it up and, you know, for the wrong reason, started kind of doing the right thing by giving these guys some end dates, and women. But then what happened was about 2 weeks later, still, even though they sent these people to different places, they weren't getting help. So there was a guy named Tim Rich, severe mental health problems. Again, the military just doped him up, put him on 24-hour suicide watch, and just kind of let him sit there. And so he decided to go up and throw himself off the top of a three-floor building. He bounced off a tree, landed on his back, got treated for a damaged spine, but was miraculously okay. And then was still left for several more weeks in the unit, and then they eventually finally discharged him. But that basically led us to kind of look around to some other places, and we started hearing about similar things at Fort Stewart, similar things at Fort Carson in Colorado Springs. And it turns out now, when we kind of expand the frame, there are holdover units all across the country. And they're treating them very, very similar to how they treated Echo Platoon. And that's where they're going to try to be getting a lot of these people to go back over to Afghanistan. That in addition to the repeated deployments of people who are already over there right now. Basically, what the folks I talked to told me regarding the search and avoid missions was one guy I remember specifically, Clifton Hicks, who's in the book, who was doing these search and avoid missions early on. He was over there in 2003 up to about mid-2004, based at a forward operating base that was actually kind of, it abutted Camp Victory, which is the name of the base at Baghdad International Airport. I love the names of these bases. Camp Victory, there's like, you know, Camp Freedom, Camp, you know, War Horse. There was one I was told was called Camp Danger. Yeah, so soldiers really wanted to be deployed at that one. But this guy told me that, he said, yeah, we were doing search and avoids before we even think they had a name. And so, but their search and avoid mission, this is a good one, they would go out of Camp Victory, and the base was so big that they would drive around the perimeter of the base and then come in the other side. And they liked to go in there because there was a Burger King and a really good shopping area where they could get DVDs and look at dirty magazines. So he said we'd leave a guy in the Humvee to call in every hour, and we'd basically go patrol Burger King and Playboy. And he said, but the great thing about it was you couldn't do a search and avoid mission without at least a platoon commander being involved, because he's you know, they're not always with the unit, but usually they're with the unit and they have to go out with them. So you had to have a commander being aware of this kind of thing. And I don't know if that was always the experience, but it seems to make sense.
What about the guys above them?
What about the guys above them? Yeah, I can't answer that question. I mean, how far up it goes, nobody really knows, could say for sure, I don't think. Yeah, pretty much all of this that I'm talking about is happening from other soldiers. I haven't talked to any of the perpetrators. They're really hard to find. I'm actually working on a piece on this right now to try to update the situation, because of what's in the book, which is absolutely awful and out of control, is now a bit out of date because things have actually worsened. But I don't remember the exact statistic, but of the perpetrators who were actually brought to court-martial, it's something like, I I think it's like less than 20% of them are ever even brought to court-martial, and then those that are actually brought to court-martial, it's over 90%, it's either 92 or 95% are set free, or given like a little slap in the wrist, oh, don't do that again. And for example, I called the Pentagon actually a few months ago to ask them, well, what is the Pentagon doing to correct this problem? And they basically said, well, we have this new program, and we're giving these new trainings, and people are given instructions on how to be more safe or whatever. And then one of the things this woman told me, I was really amazed, is she said, and we're also basically just telling people to watch each other's backs. So it's a horrible situation. It's really not getting any better, and that's why you have people like April Fitzsimmons, who I talked about, who's not anti-military. She aside from what happened to her, she really enjoyed being in the military. She liked doing service, but and is really dedicated to the military and wants to support it. But that said, is now in a position where she says, I'm just telling people, all women, not to join the military. But also, let me add, this is not only specific to women, that rape and sexual assault are happening to men in the military as well. I don't have any figures on that, but one woman whose story is in the book of her being raped by 2 soldiers on a base, on Camp Anaconda, the big base I was just talking about. She was raped in one night by 2 soldiers there. And then when she went in and was reporting it to the military's criminal investigations, was sitting there with the person doing the investigation and noticed 3 files on his desk and saw that they were all men's names. And she said, you only do investigations of rape and sexual assault, right? And he said, yeah. And she's like, these are 3 guys. He said, yeah, and they're all Marines. Yeah, I'm pulling up an article about this, because it's very, very important that we're all very clear on specifically what is U.S. foreign policy. And there's 2 documents that we all need to talk about. I've talked about them up here in Seattle before. I try to talk about them just about every time I talk about these things, and that's the National Security Strategy of the United States of America and the Quadrennial Defense Review Report. In the National Security Strategy of the United States of America, this is the driving document of U.S. foreign policy. So people, what is U.S. foreign policy? Why are we in Afghanistan? Why are we in Baghdad? I mean, didn't we free those Iraqis? And didn't we help all the women in Afghanistan, or whatever the reason they gave? This kind of thing. So I want to just read you a couple of the missions of the National Security Strategy of the United States of America. And another key thing about this document is the most recent version that we have was updated March 06 by the Bush administration. And that's the same one that we're using now under the Obama administration. So let's be very clear about how U.S. foreign policy works and how little it really means whether we have a Democrat or Republican or in the White House. So here's one of the missions, quote, ignite a new era of global economic growth through free markets and free trade. Is that why people join the military? Is that why they want to go to Iraq and Afghanistan? There's a lot more. Quote, opening markets and integrating developing countries, and, quote, reforming the international financial system to ensure stability and growth. That's part of the National Security Strategy of the United States of America. So that's why we're in Afghanistan. And then to use the U.S. military to enforce these, we have the Quadrennial Defense Review Report. Again, we're still working on a version. The most recent update was under the Bush administration. Hasn't been changed since Obama took office. Big shocker there. But one of the goals of this document for the U.S. military is to use the military to fight, quote, multiple overlapping wars. They're doing it. And to, quote, ensure that all major and emerging powers are integrated as constructive actors and stakeholders into the international system. And I think that's very telling. Sounds a little imperialistic. To ensure that all major and emerging powers are integrated as constructive actors and stakeholders into the international system. And so there's the economic aspect, and then when we look at Iraq, this is a no-brainer, arguably the 2nd largest oil reserves on the planet. We look at Afghanistan, no-brainer. Look at where the 4 major U.S. bases are in Afghanistan. They're right by the most important pipeline in the region. It's that simple. We're in dwindling resources. The entire world economy relies on oil and natural gas. Who's going to get there first? Is it going to be the U.S., or are they going to let Russia and China or the European Union or India come in and start making claims on this stuff? Well, guess what? The U.S. has one of the most important pipelines, and they have one of the biggest reserves right there in Iraq. And so people ask, well, when is it going to end? When are we going to withdraw from Iraq? When are we going to withdraw from Afghanistan? This talk is absolutely bogus. Someone asked me that last night. What's the withdrawal plan from Afghanistan? And he already knew the answer. It was kind of a loaded question. Of course, there's not one. There is not a total, full, unconditional withdrawal plan anywhere in the short, near, or long-term future for either of these occupations. It's only going to happen if it's forced by a GI resistance movement, by a civilian disobedience resistance movement that's really, really willing to start upping the ante. Because if you look at, politics in Washington, it's business as usual. We have the same security strategy, the same quadrennial defense review report, and again, no government, certainly not in this country, has ever done something simply because it's the right thing to do. Or, oh, we're going to give some of these rights back to Americans. All this stuff we took from you in the wake of 9/11, sorry about that, we're just going to give it back. And it's amazing to me that people look at a guy like Barack Obama, and actually I was at an event last night and someone said, well, he's really smart. He just needs some more time. I mean, look at this guy. Look at this guy. He's bought and paid for. He's no better than any of the rest of them. It's great that he has some charisma and can complete sentences, unlike the last guy. But when you look at policy, no change whatsoever. Yeah, he actually, the guy that threw, the Iraqi journalist with Baghdad TV who threw his shoe at George W. Bush, actually just wrote a beautiful column for The Guardian explaining, he threw his shoe because those were the shoes he wore walking into countless homes devastated by the occupation and, walking through the blood of his fellow country people who'd been spilled under the occupation. And that, when he had the chance to throw the shoe and make the statement at, the king war criminal Bush, that he felt morally obliged to do so. He is out of jail. Whether he chooses to leave Iraq or not, I'm not sure. I think he's still in Baghdad right now, but certainly he's going to be running a campaign to try to name some names and try to hold some folks accountable, because he is already overtly saying in public that, yes, I was tortured and abused while I was in jail. Yeah, it's kind of like the Obama Kool-Aid. People drink a lot of Obama Kool-Aid from like October to November, and it's obviously pretty potent stuff, because a lot of people are still thinking, well, he just needs some more time, and his hands are tied, and he's trying to change the direction of the Titanic. But I actually really like that analogy. But no, it's been, I think, really, really challenging for people in the anti-war movement, because under Bush it was easy. I mean, if you weren't outraged and shocked and pissed off enough to go do something then you were, truly asleep. But now under Obama, it has kind of given a lot of people permission, I think, to say, well, I worked really hard on the campaign, and I voted, like voting as activism, and it really has just been essentially a brilliant remarketing, rebranding job of the same U.S. empire project that is corporate-backed, corporate-based. It's all about global hegemony, and people, again, thinking this guy or the next woman or whoever that gets into that position is actually going to do the kind of change that has to happen in this country is, they need to read some history. That, governments never willingly give up power. It's always up to us to take it from them. And then, of course, the other quote that it seems so radical today, but it shouldn't be, and it's not my quote, but, people shouldn't be afraid of their governments. Governments should be afraid of their people, and we need to get back to that place. That's a really good point, and that's true. And it's another reason why I point out, it's these documents that don't change, and it's the lower-ranking bureaucracy well beneath the office of presidents that really is running things. And of course, all of this being answerable to specifically corporate America. I mean, I had one of my colleagues that told me specifically they were sitting in a senator's office waiting to go interview a particular senator that we won't name, that literally watched a corporate lobbyist walk in with a bill and say, all right, here it is, we did the changes that we wanted to make to this, and now he can sign off on it. So that's what's writing the legislation in this country, and that's what's actually running things. So yeah, I think that's a really important point, whether it was Obama or anyone else that actually somehow managed to get in to the White House and then actually really started to make some seriously radical change. Yeah, I think, I don't think they'd last long. Yeah, that's a really important point. And to a certain extent, these numbers are being kept, but overall, that said, it's impossible because, you know, when you get these guys coming back, for example, like I got a guy in the book, Brian Castler, the Marine that I spoke about, and he told me, look, I came back and I had PTSD and I couldn't get in to see the VA, and I found myself doing things like going down the highway and closing my eyes for 10 seconds just to see if I'd hit something. And miraculously he never did, and he's okay, and he's gotten some help, and he's doing a lot better. But like, so what happens if he hits something and he dies? Like, how's that gonna be tabulated? i.e. it's not. What about when folks, you know, are self-medicating with booze and drugs, and, you know, drug deals gone bad, or they off themselves, or, you know, how many drunk drivers, you know, the fact that 1 out of 4 homeless people on the streets of this country are a veteran of some war. All of this adds up. And again, you know, most of this, it's like, how do you quantify it? It's really amazing, you know. And there was another story, not too dissimilar from Leo Church's, not quite as extreme, but there was a guy that we talked with. Actually, it's in the story we have coming out about how there are now these different echo platoons all around the country. And it was a guy who was in the '91 war, came back home, his wife got pregnant, and they had a girl, and several of her internal organs were, when she was born, were outside of her body. And so she needed, obviously, some serious surgeries to get this corrected. And he was in the military still and said, look, I need to go home, I need some time off, I got to go take care of my daughter, she's literally going to die if I don't do this. And similar to church, they said, no, you got to stay here, you got to do your thing. And so he went AWOL. You know, this unpatriotic guy decides he's going to betray his country to go AWOL. Oh, you know, the gall of this guy to go save his daughter's life. He does that. She gets her treatment, she's better, he comes back to the military. Here's what I did, I'm turning myself back in, I went AWOL, because here's my daughter, here's her medical records. So now he's in one of these holdover units, and now they're saying, you know, if you want to go to Afghanistan? I mean, and that's what's happening. So again, like, how does that quantify into, you know, Gulf War syndrome and this kind of thing? And I think that that's where, you know, we get, when we look at the bigger picture, it's very dark. And we look at Joe Stiglitz's book, The $3 Trillion War. Most of you are probably familiar with this. You know, Nobel laureate economist writes, his most conservative estimate is when you look at Iraq and you factor in all the real costs, like what will this war really cost, for example, if we actually did include taking care of someone with traumatic brain injury for the rest of their lives, or someone that, you know, lost both their legs, you know, all their treatment. And when you include all this stuff, we look at, assuming the war would end, I think he assumed it would end in 20 years, which, again, he's being very gracious. Then projecting the figures into the future, he came up with a $3 trillion war. And when we talk about, just from an economic standpoint, just to give you an idea how much money we're talking about, what is a trillion? Someone, I had a professor up at University of Alaska tell me once, he said, think of it this way. How many years is 1 trillion seconds? How many years is 1 trillion seconds? Just think about a number in your mind for a second. You know, it's a pretty good number. It's a lot. It's just over 31,000 years, 1 trillion seconds. So we're talking about conservatively 3 trillion just for Iraq. We're not even talking about Afghanistan. And that's just economically. We're not even talking about human costs. And again, you know, what is this? You know, talk about a cancer for the country. It's really pretty mind-boggling stuff. Yeah, I don't really have many more details. There was a pretty good write-up on it in Mother Jones magazine not too long ago, but they're actively taking known white supremacists into the military, along with known criminals. You know, like I said, there's at least 8,000 people with rap sheets in the military. There's convicted rapists in the military. There's gang members. There's convicted robbers, all of these types of people, and including white supremacists. And so they have, it has been documented that, and I don't remember the specifics off the top of my head, I just read the article, but they have actually gone out and specifically actively recruited in and from white supremacist groups. I would just add that, the main thing is taking action, that, whether it's, someone's and I don't advocate for someone, throw everything behind the occupations, because we have climate change, which is, going to supersede everything. Pick a topic. There's 8 gazillion things wrong that need good, positive action. And I think that the main thing is finding whatever the thing is that you're the most passionate about, whether it is anti-recruitment or climate change or ending the death penalty, or whatever the thing is, and basically just finding groups in the area, join those groups, and go start taking action. And I think real grassroots action, going out and tangibly helping people, and that's why I really think, one hope in a real hope and a real goal, a tangible one in ending these occupations, is not about writing Congress people. It's not about writing senators. It's about going one-to-one, find out where these soldiers are, and telling people, look, if you really want to end this, this is what has to happen. You have to find these people. You have to hear their stories. You have to give them support, and you have to, get groups of people behind them if they're going to resist, marshal resources, covering expenses, finding lawyers, and this is where Coffee Strong comes in. Because that's a great place to find these people and find other people, learn about military law, become a GI rights advocate. You can start working on the GI rights hotline. I mean, there's tons of things that people can do. They just need to figure out basically where is their red line. Because, there's a guy, Derek Jensen, in Northern California. I really respect his work. And he basically, he looks at it like, look, industrial growth society is basically killing the planet. So where are people's red lines? 90% of the pelagic fish in the oceans are wiped out already. Scores of species are going extinct daily. So where is your red line? Where is the red line? How many, over 1 million Iraqis have been killed since '03. Is that a red line? Is 100,000 American troops in Afghanistan a red line? Is it going to be 150,000? Because all these red lines are going to happen if people just sit back. And I think each person, each one of us needs to decide, what is my red line? What is that point? What is that threshold that when this is hit, I absolutely have to go out that door and start doing something? And I think that's, something that we have, to ask ourselves regularly as well as other folks. Just ask them like, okay, well, okay, you agree with me that all this is really, really bad and has to change. So what's it going to take for you to get out the door and actually start taking action to do things? Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Ron.